The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Westminster Bridge as thousands of tourists moved like a slow river toward Buckingham Palace. Among them walked Karen Whitmore, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her Chanel blazer, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently against her phone screen. At 42, Karen had built her entire identity around being someone important. Her husband's successful law firm, her membership at the exclusive country club, and her position on the charity board of the local hospital all fed into her belief that she deserved special treatment wherever she went. Excuse me, Karen huffed, pushing past a family of tourists who were moving too slowly for her liking. She had exactly 45 minutes before her lunch appointment at the Ritz, and she absolutely refused to be late. Her friend Melissa was flying in from New York, and Karen intended to spend the entire meal bragging about her recent invitation to the mayor's gala. As she approached the palace gates, Karen noticed a crowd had gathered around something near the Victoria Memorial. The mob of people blocked her usual shortcut through the area, and she could feel her irritation rising like steam from a kettle. These tourists had no sense of urgency, no understanding that some people had important places to be. "What's all this fuss about?" Karen muttered to herself, checking her watch again. She decided to push through the crowd using her elbows and sharp comments to clear a path. "Some of us have actual appointments to keep," she announced loudly as she squeezed between a couple taking selfies. At the center of the crowd stood a young man in an elaborate red uniform. He was completely motionless, standing at perfect attention with a tall black hat and ceremonial sword at his side. His face was like stone, showing no expression despite the dozens of people taking photos around him. Some tourists were making faces at him, others were trying to get him to smile, and a few children were waving their hands in front of his face. Karen stopped and stared at the scene with disgust. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" she said loud enough for everyone around her to hear. "It's just another street performer trying to make money off tourists. How pathetic." An elderly gentleman standing nearby turned to her with a confused expression. "I beg your pardon, madam, but I believe that's an actual what?" Karen cut him off with a sharp laugh. "An actual person standing around in a costume hoping people will throw coins at him? Please, I've seen a dozen of these fake guards around London. They're all over the place pretending to be official when they're really just beggars in fancy dress." The man looked uncomfortable and started to speak again, but Karen had already moved closer to the uniformed figure. She walked right up to him, invading his personal space in a way that made several onlookers gasp. "You know, this is really quite ridiculous," Karen announced to the crowd. "This man is taking advantage of your ignorance. These aren't real guards, people. The actual royal guards are inside the palace doing important work, not standing around like mannequins for your entertainment." The young man in uniform didn't move a muscle. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his breathing steady and controlled. Karen found his lack of response infuriating. "I'm talking to you," she said, stepping even closer. "Don't you think it's time to drop this silly act? Some of us are trying to get somewhere important." A woman with a thick German accent spoke up from the crowd. "Excuse me, but I think you should leave him alone. He is doing his job." Karen whirled around to face the tourist. "His job? His job is to stand around and collect money from gullible people like you. This whole thing is a scam, and I'm tired of watching you all fall for it." She turned back to the guard and waved her hand directly in front of his face. "See? No reaction because he knows I'm right. He's just some unemployed actor trying to make rent money." More people in the crowd began to murmur among themselves. Some seemed to believe Karen's claims, while others looked increasingly uncomfortable with her behavior. A few started taking out their phones to record what was happening. "You should all be ashamed of yourselves for encouraging this nonsense," Karen continued, her voice growing louder. "And you," she pointed directly at the guard's face, "should get a real job instead of playing dress-up for tourists." The guard's discipline was absolute. Despite Karen's aggressive behavior and insulting words, he maintained his position without the slightest movement. His hands remained perfectly positioned, his posture unchanged, his gaze fixed on the distance beyond the crowd. This complete lack of response only made Karen angrier. She was used to getting reactions from people, used to her sharp tongue and important connections making others back down. The fact that this street performer was ignoring her felt like a personal insult. "I suppose you think you're very clever," Karen said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Standing there like a statue, hoping people will be impressed by your discipline. Well, I'm not impressed. I've seen real discipline, and this isn't it." She began to circle around the guard, examining his uniform with the critical eye of someone looking for flaws. "Look at this costume," she announced to the crowd. "The stitching is probably cheap, the materials are definitely not authentic. I bet if you looked closely, you'd find a label saying, 'Made in China' somewhere." Several tourists began to look uncertain. Karen's confidence and upper-class accent made her sound authoritative. Even though her claims were completely wrong, she noticed their hesitation and pressed her advantage. "I can't believe how easily fooled you all are," Karen said, shaking her head in mock disappointment. "This man is laughing at you behind that serious expression. He's probably thinking about how much money he's going to make from your photographs and tips." A young American couple started to back away from the scene. "Maybe we should just go," the woman whispered to her boyfriend. "This is getting weird." But Karen wasn't finished. She had an audience now, and she was determined to prove her point. "You want to know how I know this is fake?" she asked the remaining crowd. "Because real guards don't just stand around in public spaces. They have actual duties, actual responsibilities. They don't pose for pictures with tourists." The guard continued to maintain his position, his training evident in every controlled breath and steady stance. Years of discipline and dedication to his duty showed in his absolute stillness, even in the face of such provocation. "Furthermore," Karen continued, warming to her subject, "real royal guards would never allow themselves to be treated this way. They would have authority, respect, backup. This man is clearly just hoping you won't know the difference between a real guard and a fake one." She walked back to face the guard directly, her eyes narrowing as she studied his face. "I know exactly what you're doing, and I'm not going to let you get away with it. These people work hard for their money, and they don't deserve to be scammed by someone in a carnival costume." The crowd was now split between those who were starting to believe Karen and those who remained convinced they were witnessing something authentic. The tension in the air was thick, and several people began pulling out their phones to record the confrontation. "You know what?" Karen said suddenly, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. "I'm going to prove to everyone here that you're nothing but a fraud." She reached into her handbag and pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts with a satisfied smile. "I have connections in this city that you couldn't even imagine. I'm going to call someone who actually knows about royal protocol, and they're going to expose you for what you really are." The guard's eyes remained fixed ahead. But there was something in his stillness that suggested an inner strength that went far beyond what any street performer could possess. His uniform was indeed authentic, every detail perfect, every insignia genuine. But Karen's arrogance blinded her to these obvious signs. "Yes, I'm sure my friend at the Department of Culture will be very interested to hear about unauthorized individuals impersonating royal guards," Karen said loudly, making sure everyone could hear her. "This sort of thing is probably illegal, and I intend to see that something is done about it." The remaining tourists watched in fascination and growing discomfort as Karen dialed a number on her phone. Some began to whisper among themselves, wondering if they should leave before things got more heated. Others remained curious about how the situation would unfold. "Hello, James. It's Karen Whitmore," she said into her phone, her voice suddenly sweet and professional. "Yes, I know it's been ages. Listen, I'm calling because I'm standing here near Buckingham Palace, and there's a man in a fake guard uniform trying to scam tourists. I thought you should know." She listened for a moment, her expression confident and smug. "Oh, yes. I'm absolutely certain he's fake. I've been watching him for several minutes now, and it's obvious he's just a street performer. The tourists are completely fooled, but I know better." The guard remained motionless throughout Karen's phone conversation, his discipline unshakable. Whatever training had brought him to this moment had prepared him for far worse than one angry woman with an oversized ego. "What do you mean? Where exactly am I?" Karen asked into the phone, her confidence wavering slightly. "I'm right by the Victoria Memorial, next to the palace gates. There's a crowd of people around this fake guard." She listened again, and for the first time, her expression showed a flicker of uncertainty. "What do you mean, that area? I don't understand what you're—" Karen's voice trailed off as she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Other uniformed figures were visible in the distance, moving with purpose and authority. These were clearly official personnel, and their presence made the situation suddenly feel more serious than she had anticipated. "James, let me call you back," Karen said quickly, ending the call and putting her phone away. She looked around at the crowd with growing unease, finally noticing details that should have been obvious from the beginning. The quality of the guard's uniform was flawless. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. His posture and bearing spoke of extensive military training. Most importantly, his position was clearly official, marked by barriers and signs that Karen had been too angry to notice in her rush to prove him wrong. But Karen's pride wouldn't let her back down now. Too many people had heard her claims, and admitting she was wrong would be more humiliating than continuing her attack. She decided to double down on her accusations, even as doubt began to creep into her mind. "Well," she announced to the crowd, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence, "I still say something's not right here. Real guards don't behave this way, and I intend to get to the bottom of it." Karen's moment of doubt passed quickly, replaced by an even stronger determination to prove her point. She couldn't allow herself to be wrong, not in front of all these people. Her reputation and self-image depended on being the smartest person in any room, and she wasn't about to let some silent man in uniform make her look foolish. "You know what I'm going to do," Karen announced to the crowd, her voice regaining its earlier arrogance. "I'm going to test this supposed guard's training. If he's real, he should be able to handle a simple conversation about his duties." She moved even closer to the guard, close enough that her breath could be felt on his uniform. "So, Mr. Royal Guard, what exactly are your orders for today? What's your regiment? Who's your commanding officer?" The guard maintained his silence, his eyes never wavering from their fixed point in the distance. His breathing remained steady and controlled, showing no sign that Karen's proximity or questions affected him in any way. "See?" Karen said triumphantly to the crowd. "A real guard would at least acknowledge questions about his duty. This man can't answer because he doesn't know anything about actual royal protocol." A middle-aged man wearing a Union Jack t-shirt stepped forward from the crowd. "Actually, miss, I think real guards are trained not to speak while on duty. My brother served in the military and he always said—" "Your brother wasn't a royal guard," Karen cut him off dismissively. "I'm talking about elite personnel who protect the monarchy. They have different protocols, different training. This man clearly doesn't have that background." She turned back to the guard, her voice becoming more aggressive. "Let's try something else, shall we? If you're really on duty, then you must have protocols for dealing with security threats. What would you do if someone approached the royal family right now?" The guard's silence continued, but there was something in his stillness that spoke of readiness, of training so deep it had become instinct. His hand position near his ceremonial sword wasn't decorative. It was the stance of someone who knew exactly how to use it if necessary. Karen misread his continued silence as weakness. "I thought so. You can't answer because you've never actually been trained for real security work. You're just memorizing how to stand still and look important." She began walking around him again, this time more aggressively, trying to get him to break his position. "What's your name, fake guard? What's your real job when you're not playing dress up? Are you an actor? A street performer? Unemployed?" Several tourists began to look uncomfortable with Karen's increasingly hostile behavior. A woman with 2 small children quietly moved away from the scene, not wanting her kids to witness what seemed to be turning into harassment. "I bet you don't even live in London," Karen continued, her voice growing louder. "Probably came here from some small town thinking you could make easy money fooling tourists. Well, I've got news for you. Some of us actually know what real Royal Guards look like." The guard's discipline was absolute. Years of training had prepared him for much worse than verbal attacks from angry civilians. His duty was clear: maintain his post, protect his position, and uphold the dignity of his service regardless of provocation. But Karen interpreted his silence as an admission of guilt. "You can't defend yourself because there is no defense. You're caught, and everyone here now knows the truth." She pulled out her phone again, this time opening the camera app. "I'm going to document this fraud for the authorities. They need to know that people are impersonating Royal Guards in this area." As she raised her phone to take photos, something unexpected happened. A black sedan with tinted windows pulled up nearby, and 2 men in dark suits stepped out. They weren't tourists or casual passers-by. Their bearing and alertness marked them as professional security personnel. Karen noticed them but misunderstood their significance. "Perfect timing," she said loudly. "These gentlemen can probably help sort out this situation. Officers, over here!" The 2 men approached the scene with quick, efficient movements. One of them spoke into a small radio device while scanning the crowd. The other walked directly toward Karen, his expression serious and professional. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the guard," the first man said firmly but politely. Karen's confidence soared. Finally, someone with authority was taking her seriously. "Thank you for responding so quickly. I've been trying to explain to these tourists that this man is not a real Royal Guard. He's obviously some kind of street performer, and I think what he's doing might be illegal." The security officer exchanged a quick glance with his partner. "Ma'am, I need you to understand that you are currently interfering with an active duty member of Her Majesty's Guard." Karen laughed, thinking the man was confused. No, you don't understand. This person is pretending to be a guard. I've been testing him, asking him questions about his duties, and he can't answer any of them. Real guards would know their protocols." "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice becoming more stern, "members of the Queen's Guard do not speak while on ceremonial duty. This is a fundamental aspect of their training and discipline." For the first time, Karen felt a genuine flicker of uncertainty. "Well, yes, but surely they would respond to legitimate questions about security concerns. I was asking about his orders, his commanding officer. Information that would never be shared with unauthorized civilians," the second officer interjected. "Ma'am, you need to move away from this area immediately." Karen looked around at the crowd, many of whom were now watching her with expressions ranging from pity to outright disapproval. The confident murmurs of agreement she had heard earlier were gone, replaced by uncomfortable silence. "There must be some misunderstanding," Karen said, her voice less certain than before. "I have connections in this city. I know people who work with royal protocol. My husband's firm has handled legal matters for several members of the peerage." The first officer pulled out a small device that looked like an official credentials scanner. "Ma'am, what's your name and identification?" "Karen Whitmore," she replied automatically, then caught herself. "Wait, why do you need my identification? I haven't done anything wrong. I was trying to protect these tourists from being scammed." "Mrs. Whitmore, you have been harassing a member of Her Majesty's Guard while he was performing his official duties. This is a serious offense." The color began to drain from Karen's face as the full implications of the situation started to become clear. Harassing? I wasn't harassing anyone. I was simply questioning. I thought he was... You thought he was what, ma'am? The second officer asked. Karen looked at the guard, who still hadn't moved or acknowledged the commotion around him. For the first time, she really looked at his uniform, his bearing, his absolute discipline. Details that should have been obvious from the beginning suddenly became clear. The precision of his posture wasn't something an amateur could fake. The quality of his uniform was far beyond what any street performer could afford. His position was clearly official, marked by ceremonial boundaries and posting orders that Karen had been too arrogant to notice. I made a mistake, Karen said quietly, the words feeling like glass in her throat. Yes, ma'am, you did, the first officer agreed. A very serious mistake. The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the arrival of the official security personnel. Many people were now recording the scene on their phones, capturing Karen's humiliation for posterity. Please, Karen said, desperation creeping into her voice. Surely we can handle this quietly. I didn't mean any harm. I genuinely thought... You thought you knew better than everyone else, said an elderly woman in the crowd. You thought you were smarter than all these tourists, smarter than the authorities, smarter than the guard himself. Karen turned toward the voice, her face flushing with embarrassment. I was trying to help. You were showing off, the woman continued, making a spectacle of yourself and disrupting this young man's duty for no reason other than your own ego. The truth of the accusation hit Karen like a physical blow. She had been showing off, trying to prove her superiority to a crowd of strangers. Her need to be the smartest person around had blinded her to obvious facts and led her into this humiliating situation. What happens now? Karen asked the officers, her voice small and uncertain. That depends, the first officer replied, on your cooperation and on whether the guard chooses to file a formal complaint. Karen looked at the guard again, really seeing him for the first time. His discipline in the face of her sustained attack had been extraordinary. He had endured her insults, her invasion of his personal space, and her attempts to undermine his authority without breaking his composure even slightly. I want to apologize, Karen said suddenly. To him, to the guard. I want to apologize for my behavior. The officer shook his head. Ma'am, the guard cannot acknowledge your apology while on duty. His orders prevent him from responding to civilian interactions. Then how can what should I do? You should leave this area immediately and consider yourself fortunate that this didn't escalate further. The guard's restraint and professionalism are the only reasons you're not facing more serious consequences. Karen nodded numbly, understanding for the first time the full extent of her mistake. She had attacked someone who couldn't defend himself, questioned the competence of someone whose training was far superior to anything she could imagine, and made a fool of herself in front of dozens of witnesses. I'll go, she said quietly. I'll leave right away. As she turned to walk away, Karen caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window of a nearby shop. The confident, superior woman who had arrived here an hour ago was gone, replaced by someone who looked small, embarrassed, and utterly deflated. But her humiliation was far from over. As she would soon discover, her confrontation with the Royal Guard was about to take an even more shocking turn that would change everything she thought she knew about the young man she had so foolishly attacked. Karen walked away from the scene with her head down, her designer heels clicking against the pavement in an unsteady rhythm that matched her shattered confidence. The murmurs and whispers of the crowd followed her like accusers, and she could feel dozens of eyes watching her retreat. Her hands shook slightly as she tried to process what had just happened, her mind reeling from the complete reversal of everything she had believed just moments before. She found a bench about 50 meters away from the crowd and sat down heavily, her legs no longer feeling steady enough to support her. The magnitude of her mistake was beginning to sink in, and with it came a crushing sense of embarrassment that made her stomach churn. She had made a fool of herself in front of strangers, attacked someone who was simply doing his job, and shown herself to be exactly the kind of arrogant, ignorant person she had always claimed to despise. Karen pulled out her phone and stared at the screen, unsure of what to do next. Her lunch appointment at the Ritz seemed unimportant now, overshadowed by the humiliation she had just endured. She considered calling her husband to tell him what had happened, but the thought of admitting her mistake to Richard made her feel even more nauseated. As she sat there trying to collect herself, Karen noticed increased activity near the palace gates. Several official vehicles had arrived, and personnel in various uniforms were moving with obvious urgency. At first, she assumed it was just normal palace business, but then she saw something that made her blood run cold. A magnificent Rolls-Royce with royal flags approached the gates, followed by a convoy of security vehicles. The crowd of tourists began to buzz with excitement, pointing and taking photos as they realized they were about to witness an official royal arrival or departure. Karen watched from her bench as the convoy came to a stop near the area where she had just humiliated herself. Palace staff emerged from various entrances, forming orderly lines along the route. The precision and ceremony of their movements made it clear that this was no ordinary event. Then she saw something that made her heart stop. The young guard she had attacked was being approached by a senior officer with elaborate insignia on his uniform. Instead of relieving him of duty, the officer spoke briefly to the guard and then stepped back to attention. Karen couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see the guard's posture change slightly. For the first time since she had encountered him, he moved, turning with military precision and beginning to walk toward the arriving convoy. "Oh no," Karen whispered to herself, a terrible suspicion beginning to form in her mind. "Please tell me this isn't—" Her worst fears were confirmed moments later when the guard took his position, not as a bystander or minor ceremonial figure, but as part of the official reception party for whoever was in that Rolls-Royce. His placement was clearly significant, marking him as someone with important duties and high clearance. Karen watched in growing horror as the car door opened and a member of the royal family stepped out, immediately greeted by the same young man she had spent 20 minutes calling a fraud and a fake. The guard's posture was perfect, his movements precise and professional as he took his designated place in the official ceremony. "Dear God," Karen breathed, realizing the full scope of her mistake. He wasn't just any guard. He was— She couldn't finish the thought. The implications were too overwhelming, too mortifying to fully process. She had attacked, insulted, and tried to humiliate someone who was not only a real member of the Queen's Guard, but clearly someone with significant responsibilities and status within that organization. As she watched the ceremony unfold, Karen began to notice details about the guard that she had completely missed during her aggressive confrontation. The deference shown to him by other personnel, the specific position he held in the formation, the way senior officers acknowledged him with obvious respect. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and she looked down to see it was from her friend James at the Department of Culture, the same person she had called during her attack on the guard. "Karen, I've been making some inquiries about your call earlier. The person you described sounds like Lieutenant Alexander Hartwell of the Coldstream Guards. He's not just any guardsman. He's one of the youngest officers ever to be selected for personal protection duty. Are you absolutely certain he was fake?" Karen's hands began to tremble as she read the message. Lieutenant Alexander Hartwell, a real officer. Someone selected for the highest levels of royal protection duty. And she had called him a street performer, a fraud, a fake who couldn't get a real job. She looked up from her phone to see that more people were gathering to watch the royal ceremony. Many of them had cameras and phones out, recording everything. With a sinking feeling, Karen realized that her earlier confrontation had probably been captured on dozens of devices, and the contrast between her accusations and the guard's obvious importance would make her humiliation complete. Another text message arrived from James. Karen, Lieutenant Hartwell is decorated for his service in Afghanistan. He's been selected for some of the most prestigious duties in the British military. If you actually confronted him thinking he was fake, you need to understand how seriously wrong you were. Each word felt like a hammer blow to Karen's already shattered ego. Decorated for service in Afghanistan, selected for prestigious duties, one of the youngest officers ever chosen for personal protection. Everything about Lieutenant Hartwell spoke of exceptional competence, bravery, and dedication, and she had treated him like a common criminal. Karen watched as the ceremony continued, seeing Lieutenant Hartwell perform his duties with the same perfect discipline he had shown during her attack. He moved with confidence and precision, clearly comfortable in his role and respected by everyone around him. "I have to do something," Karen said aloud, though she wasn't sure what that something might be. An apology seemed inadequate for the magnitude of her behavior, but she couldn't just walk away without trying to make some kind of amends. She stood up from the bench and began walking back toward the area where the ceremony was taking place, though she stayed well outside the official boundaries. As she got closer, she could see Lieutenant Hartwell more clearly, and for the first time she really looked at his face. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably in his late 20s, with the kind of bearing that spoke of natural leadership and exceptional training. Even from a distance, there was something about him that commanded respect, something she had been too blinded by arrogance to recognize during their earlier encounter. Karen found herself thinking about everything she had said to him, every insult and accusation she had thrown at him while he stood there unable to respond. The memory made her feel physically sick. She had attacked someone who had dedicated his life to service, someone who had probably risked his life for his country, someone whose discipline and professionalism were clearly exemplary. As the ceremony concluded and the royal convoy prepared to depart, Karen saw her chance. Lieutenant Hartwell was moving toward a position where she might be able to approach him, though she wasn't sure if he would be allowed to acknowledge her or if she would even be permitted near him. She walked closer, her heart pounding with nervousness and shame. When she was about 10 meters away, Lieutenant Hartwell seemed to sense her presence and turned slightly in her direction. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Karen saw something in his expression that made her feel even worse about her behavior. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment or hostility. Instead, there was a kind of professional detachment mixed with what looked almost like pity. He had dealt with her attack with the same calm competence he brought to all his duties, and her attempt to humiliate him had probably seemed more pathetic than threatening. Karen opened her mouth to try to say something, but before she could speak, Lieutenant Hartwell gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't acknowledgement of her presence, so much as a signal that he understood she was there and that he held no personal animosity toward her. Then he turned back to his duties, and the moment was over. Karen stood there for several more minutes, watching as the ceremony concluded, and Lieutenant Hartwell disappeared into the palace complex. She realized that her brief encounter with him had taught her more about dignity, professionalism, and grace under pressure than all her years of social climbing and status seeking. As she finally turned to leave, Karen pulled out her phone and began typing a message to James. "You were right about Lieutenant Hartwell. I made a terrible mistake today, and I need to find a way to make it right. Can you help me understand the proper channels for apologizing to someone I wronged so badly?" She sent the message and began the long walk back to her car, knowing that her comfortable world of assumptions and arrogance had been permanently shattered. The young man she had tried to humiliate had shown her what real strength looked like, and the lesson would stay with her for the rest of her life. Lieutenant Alexander Hartwell, meanwhile, continued his duties with the same perfect discipline he had maintained throughout Karen's attack. Her words and behavior had rolled off him like water off stone, leaving no lasting impact on someone whose sense of duty and professionalism ran far deeper than any civilian's opinion. But for Karen, the encounter would mark the beginning of a long journey toward understanding the difference between real importance and the hollow status she had spent so many years pursuing. She had learned, in the most humiliating way possible, that true nobility comes not from titles or connections, but from service, discipline, and the quiet strength to do one's duty regardless of the obstacles placed in one's path.